All right, everyone. We continue our series here on Mark Rogers TV. We're talking to bloggers across the country. Of course, they're avid football fans. Of course, they've got to be if they're covering their team all the time, nonstop. And so those wins are great, but those losses really sting. And we bring in Mitch Harper from lawlessrepublic.com and also Cougar Center following BYU athletics. And specifically here, of course, on Mark Rogers TV, we're talking college football. So, Mitch, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here. Looking forward to talking about it.
We
Well,
had a great time talking about old bowl games. We just pretty much went through BYU history, talking about postseason play in particular. So check out that video and leave your comments about the big wins that stand out for you. Now we go to the flip side. Got to talk about the losses because if you're a real college football fan, the losses almost stay with you a lot more than the wins because especially if you're rooting for a really good football team, Mitch, it's one thing if you're losing 7, 8 football games a year, but if you're rooting for a team that's usually losing 1, 2, 3 football games a year, man, you expect a lot out of your team, and so the wins you just kind of check off. Then when you lose one, wow, it stings. So what are those losses that have really stuck with you through the years?
yeah. So with BYU, losses have hurt. BYU's been a program that's always been on the cusp. Fighting for that respect, fighting for that vindication. So those times when BYU feels like they're in the national psyche and they're a program that, hey, this is the year. This is the year of BYU. There might be a game that just crushes your soul, crushes your BYU fandom at times. And so talking about looking over these games and thinking back over the years, there's been some bone-crushing losses that definitely probably stick sometimes more vivid than the wins. First loss, excuse me, that kind of pops off the page to me in the wins video. I talked about the Oklahoma game and what that meant for BYU. And if you didn't see that, definitely suggest checking out the wins video. But 2 weeks later, BYU hosted Florida State. This was not famous Jameis and Florida State. This was the tail end of the Bobby Bowden era, and Florida State had just came off a win where they barely beat Jacksonville State. Jacksonville State and Doak Campbell, they barely eked out a win. And BYU was the talk of the country. They were a top 10 team, defeated Oklahoma, and then crushed Tulane. BYU was the team. BYU was the talk of the country in 2009 up to that point. And I remember College Game Day saying, Kirk Herbstreit, Lee Corso, and Corso obviously having a Florida State bias a little bit, him even saying BYU big, and he holds up the pencil. I'm thinking, is this real right now? BYU over Florida State big? I mean, BYU had a history with Florida State in like Pigskin Classics in 2000 and 1991 out in Anaheim. So BYU had never knocked off the Noles, and this was the game. I mean, BYU was a double-digit favorite. It was just mind-blowing to think as a BYU fan and someone that covers BYU to see this. And going into that game just from the get-go, Christian Ponder, and who in his own right was a dang good player at Florida State, not to take anything away from him, but this wasn't the Florida State we saw this past year. And Florida State just crushed BYU, just from start to finish. BYU's offense was pretty good that game, and they had some good players with Max Hall and Harvey Younga and Dennis Pitta. But Florida State just from start to finish took it to BYU and put up a 54 spot on the Cougars in Provo. And after the game, Florida State's ripping up pieces of the turf. The players are celebrating because they took out number 9 BYU, and it just crushed all the hopes BYU fans and BYU folks had thought like this was the team to go undefeated and to have a chance to break down the system yet again and play for the BCS National Championship. But losing to Florida State crushed all those dreams. And it was just one of those losses that kind of the program still in some ways is reeling from because BYU hasn't been to that national platform since. So losing that game was really, really hurt. And kind of set BYU back, and BYU went on to have a good year that year, 11-2. But TCU was the premier team in the Mountain West that season. Other games with losses, 1996, 14-1 on the season. The lone loss came at Washington, and Washington was another program like Florida State that BYU just could not get over the hump with. BYU traveled to Husky Stadium. They had the big win in Week 1 in the Pigskin Classic over Texas A&M, who was number 13 in the country, and they traveled to Wisconsin 3 weeks later and was undefeated in the top 25. Similar situation, but came up short. Steve Sarkisian, now the head coach at USC, was sacked 8 times by the Washington defense, and Jim Lambright's squad just took down BYU yet again. It was tough too, because BYU and Washington, they obviously don't play very often, but they kind of have this little bit of a rivalry. It dates back to 1984 when the Chicago Tribune named Washington the People's Champ and the real national champion, but BYU was obviously the AP and the UPI national champ. So a little bit of there's no love lost when BYU and Washington lock horns. So losing that one was stung. It stung a lot because that BYU team was really talented, and if had they went 15-0. Man, you would have saw a situation where arguably BYU is playing Florida for the national title in the Sugar Bowl instead of a rematch between Florida and Florida State again. That was the year for BYU to maybe do something. They could have held up another crystal ball in their case had they went 15-0 that season. So that Washington game really stings for years now. Other game I look at, 1983 at Baylor. Now the 1983 BYU team was, man, the talent on that team, you're talking college football royalty in a way, Hall of Famers in the sport. Gordon Hudson, Steve Young. This was the best BYU team ever assembled to that point in the Lavelle Edwards era. 1983 team was remarkable. They had over 600 points offensively, and they lost in Waco to the Bears to open the season Week 1, but the rest of the year just dominated through their competition. They had a close one against Missouri in the Holiday Bowl, but that 83 Baylor game was the lone loss to the season. BYU's had many seasons where they've came close to being undefeated. Another one that was in a bowl game, 1979, Indiana in the Holiday Bowl. BYU looking for their first win, undefeated going into that game, number 9 in the country, trying to make a case that maybe they deserve to get some votes for number 1. And Lee Corso's Indiana Hoosiers took down BYU, which was a shocking upset because Indiana in their own right was not the Indiana we're used to today. They were a ranked team, 8-4 or 8-3, or excuse me, 7-4 going into that game in the top 25. And BYU, by all means, choked that game away in 79. Would have been an undefeated season with Mark Wilson at quarterback for the Cougs.
Yeah, that Indiana team actually beat Michigan on the road that year. That was a very good Indiana Hoosiers team, and I thought I was going to trump you by letting you know that Lee Corso was the coach of the Indiana team. So well done, Mitch. Very well done.
Thank you, sir. But other games that I think back to with BYU and losses, BYU had an amazing streak. It's probably one that maybe people nationally don't know much about. 361 games though consecutively without being shut out. That heading into the 2003 season, it was the final game of the 2003 season. 361 straight games, remarkable, and it would still be going today had it not been for this one game against in-state rival Utah. 2003 Utah game was backbreaking. It kind of was a sign where BYU was at as a program and where Utah was kind of heading. And just some history with this rivalry, BYU and Utah. It's one of the nastiest rivalries in the country. I know everyone says that about their rivalry, but when you factor in the style of these games, how they're played, the close finishes every year, and then you have the religious undertones. It's like the good guys in BYU versus the bad guys in Utah, and you just got this animosity. Whenever you bring religion into something, it just kind of jumps it up a notch. And being only 45 miles apart from each other, you're dealing with these people every day at work and just going to the grocery store. You're seeing Utah, and you're seeing BYU fans. And for decades, BYU was dominating Utah. In the 80s, it wasn't even a contest. BYU showed up and would crush Utah. I mean, they put up a 70 spot on the Utes in 1989. But in 2003, though, or excuse me, 1993. That's when things started to change for Utah. Ron McBride came in as head coach, and Utah won at BYU for the first time in years, and that was another back-breaking loss, 34-31. Chris Jurgensen, for Utah kicker, hit a 53-yard field goal and kind of changed the tone of the rivalry in 1993. And then 2003, going back to that game, Utah with Urban Meyer, first year as a head coach, had Utah rolling that season. They made the switch earlier in the year from Brett Elliott to Alex Smith at quarterback, and Utah came in as a ranked team. BYU was 4-7, their worst season ever in decades. And Gary Curl was the head coach, kind of starting to be under fire. And it was a snowy game, tons of snow, probably the most snow I've ever sat in a BYU game. And BYU lost 3-0, and was blanked for the first time since when they played Arizona State in 1971, when Arizona State was an old WAC rival. So losing that game was hard to take, because one, BYU is just known for offense, and be that inept offensively. A lot of it was due to injuries, being down to their fourth-string quarterback, and off the field suspensions. It was hard to take, though, still, because BYU at the end of the day should be scoring points, especially against their rival. And to see Utah win their first outright conference championship in 50 years on BYU's field was hard to take. And it just again turned the page in again where Utah was starting to ascend. And I still, being here and seeing Utah up close now in the Pac-12, I think we're starting to see the reality. You can't. The ugly duckling is always going to be the ugly duckling. At the end of the day. But Utah had a stretch there where they were doing some nice things, and Urban Meyer did some great things. Obviously, went to the Fiesta Bowl, but that 0-3 loss was definitely hard to swallow. Also, with Utah, 2011. Utah game was difficult because, one, BYU moves to independence, a lot of scrutiny behind that. Everyone on the surface looks at it and says, you did that as a reactionary move to Utah going to the Pac-12. You feel like you've been rejected, and you're just making a crybaby move going independence, and because you have no friends, as people like to put it. So there was a lot of hype behind the 2011 Holy Wars, different dynamic, being early in the season, first time since pre-World War II, BYU and Utah met up before in the month of September. And BYU came into that game really hyped. I mean, it was a huge game. BYU lost the previous year in 2010, but got crushed by Utah in that 2011 game, 54-10. And it really set again another tone, like that 2009 Florida State. It set a tone for independence, where BYU fans and the program felt, can they not? Is this going to be signs of things to come? Can they not compete with Utah? Obviously they can, but it was hard to swallow seeing Utah put it on BYU like they did. A lot of it was turnover aided. I mean, 7 turnovers, but Utah put it to them, and Utah has now won every year since from 2010, 11. That's 4 years in a row. 2010 to 2013. There's going to be a 2-year hiatus. They won't meet up till 2016. So it's been tough for BYU fans when it comes to the rivalry. It's been some heartbreaking losses recently.
Mitch, I'm glad you brought up the rivalry with Utah, because I'm going to plead ignorance about the tenacity, the bitterness, the intensity of this rivalry. I've always known it's a rivalry, but I had to meet some people on both sides of this rivalry in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years to understand some of the things you're talking about the religious undertones. Obviously, I knew it was a rivalry because, like most college football rivalries, they play on the last Saturday of the season. Mm-hmm. So and the proximity and the geography. Of course, Utah is going to be a rival with BYU, and that was pretty much the end of it in regards to what I knew about this rivalry, until I talked to some people and really got a feel for what this rivalry is all about and how intense it is. And you can talk about rivalries, and we love rivalries in college football, and it's at the core of college football. Unlike any other sport, I would argue that rivalries are more in the fabric of college football than any other sport. And we all grew up with them, whatever our team, whatever our conference, and we hold fast to those rivalries. But now I'm getting a better feel, and have in the last, again, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, and talking to some BYU and some Utah folks about this rivalry and all that it is. So I'm glad you give us some perspective on that. I'm going to bring up some losses here, and again, got to plead some ignorance here, because I'm bringing up losses just because I watch it from a national perspective. I know where BYU is. I know where they are on the national landscape, when they're a little bit down, when they're challenging the big boys. And so I check in for the big games. I watch all the bowl games, all the postseason games. So these are the ones that stand out to me through the years, and going back, looking at BYU. So these are probably not to the typical BYU fan losses that really sting, but these are losses when I knew BYU was the big deal and they lost some postseason games.
Okay.
So the game that really stands out to me is Ty Detmer had that magical season in 1990, and then they show up at the Holiday Bowl, which they owned the Holiday Bowl. They show up against the Aggies of Texas A&M, and he just had a miserable game, and the Aggies rolled over him 65-14. So that's one game that I remember well.
I was gonna say with that game, sure. I'm glad you mentioned that one, because that was a game that Texas A&M was running it up on BYU. R.C. Slocum and BYU, they put it on the Cougars, and they made a statement on Detmer, who was the Heisman Trophy winner that year, separated both shoulders. Detmer did in that game. That was tough. That was tough to see Detmer end his Heisman season like that, because that was just a crushing performance by the wrecking crew defense of Texas A&M. Yeah, that was a tough one.
And I think that's one game that has cemented the perception that Heisman winners struggle in postseason play. I think that's one that people very much point to, and especially at that time, we've seen many instances of it since that younger fans point to. But at that time, that was almost the landmark or classic. Look at the Heisman winner a couple weeks after winning the award. That's the Heisman jinx for you. There it is right there, 65-14, and the busted shoulders. Wow.
Yeah, and another, with that 1990 season, another heartbreaking loss, you could say, it was at Oregon. BYU coming off the euphoria of taking down the U of Miami that I talked about in the wins, and how special that was a couple weeks later. And they had a close call where they were down big the week after the Miami win against Washington State, came back and won that game. But they went at Oregon, and this wasn't an Oregon program that was what we're seeing, the flashy jerseys today. This was an Oregon program that was very down. It was like a bottom feeder in the Pac-10, and BYU went in the Autzen Stadium. They've always been known for being a loud stadium up at Autzen in Eugene, and BYU was rattled. It was a nationally televised ABC game with Brent Musburger, Jack Arute on the call, and BYU lost that one 32-16, and because BYU was number 4 in the country. Again, another season where BYU was pushing the envelope, maybe, hey, is this a national championship type team? And they choked and at Oregon, and then capped off that season, like we just said, in that Holiday Bowl against A&M. But yeah, heartbreaking loss, a couple of them. The amazing win against Miami, but some heartbreaking losses in Detmer's Heisman campaign.
Man, I'm loving this video series. We've got a Jack Arute sighting.
Yeah, Dr. Jack Arute. Yeah, when it comes to college football broadcasters, man, I don't know if you're going to find many that get excited about a college football broadcasting team like myself. I'm not to do a humble brag there, but I do love the commentators over the years.
Okay, Mitch, that means we have to bring you back sometime, and we have to lay out like we'll just run wild. We won't even come with lists. We'll just run wild talking about broadcast teams through the years in college football. That'll be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to do that.
Yes, and the many partners on the college football broadcast for Keith Jackson through the years.
Oh yeah.
Well. So these are the other ones I got for you here, Mitch. We've got This is a kind of an odd postseason situation here where BYU played Ohio State 3 times in the span of less than 10 years, or
Yeah.
about 10 years. They played them in 82, 85, and 93. Ohio State won all those 3 games. That wouldn't be any great surprise to anyone. I think you very much summarized the situation or the perception, the national perception of BYU football very well in one of the previous video posts, where BYU, when they first emerged in the late 70s, through to that national championship season, were kind of this fun. Everybody rooted for them. Man, they're fun to watch. They throw the ball all over the place. They scare the big boys. Man, they play the most exciting football. Then they win this tainted 1984 national championship, tainted to some.
Yeah.
And suddenly, they become this. Somebody needs to put them in their place. This kind of feel that's the big boys. When the big boys play them, they need to put them in their place because they shouldn't have won that national championship in 1984. And so I heard those rumblings at times when they played Ohio State. The Buckeyes took them out in pretty harsh fashion in 1982, 47-17 in that game in the Holiday. They played in the 85 Citrus Bowl defensive game, which is kind of strange with BYU involved, but and these were extremely talented Ohio State teams. Not great Ohio State teams playing in those bowl games, but teams that were loaded with NFL players. Buckeyes win that one 10-7, and then they play a 1993 game with, who was a quarterback for BYU in 93? Shoot, I can't remember. But very good quarterback, great passing game, scared Ohio State to death. We're throwing the ball in the end zone to tie the game. And we're talking about an Ohio State team that finished in the top 10 in the country. They were loaded with talent, only lost 1 game. BYU almost pulled off the upset. Buckeyes win it. That was John Cooper's first postseason win at Ohio State. They held them off 28-21. Raymond Harris ran wild for Ohio State, but BYU could throw the football, and that's what kept him in the game in that one. So those 3 stand out. Again, as a guy that watches a lot of Big Ten football, watches all the bowl games, as losses for BYU. Now, I would not expect a BYU fan to bring those to the table as crushing defeats, but 3 bowl losses to Ohio State in 11 years. And then what was an extremely, again, I don't expect a typical BYU fan to bring this one to the table, an extremely entertaining football game was watching, again, Ty Detmer against, he was drafted number 2 to the Jets. I'm going to forget his name, for Penn State running back, Blair Thomas.
Oh, Blair Thomas, yeah.
Blair Thomas and Ty Detmer going at it back and forth. 50-39 game. That was actually a 1-score game. The only reason it finished 50-39 was Penn State had a 43-39 lead. BYU driving deep in Penn State territory, about to win the game. Penn State gets the turnover and runs it all the way back for a touchdown to clinch the game. That was just a wild game, and that was the classic Penn State's going to run it down your throats. They've got the NFL running back. They're coming right at you. And can BYU possibly physically challenge this team? But on the flip side, they're going to drive Penn State crazy, throwing the ball all over the field. Very entertaining. Holiday Bowl again, living up to its reputation. Penn State wins a thriller over BYU and Ty Detmer.
Yeah, those Holiday Bowl losses against those Big Ten teams were definitely tough. Ohio State, too, I would say in some ways they were kind of heartbreaking in a way because, that 85 Citrus Bowl kind of stands out to me. Buckeyes, like I said, not the greatest team, but they had Chris Carter at wide receiver. I mean, I remember he made an amazing catch in that game. But, Robbie Bosco, his senior year in 85, he was a guy that the whole year it wasn't really practicing at all. He was really injured, banged up, and just didn't. That offense was just sputtering at the tail end of that 85 season, and that was definitely tough to swallow. And then in 93, you were talking about a quarterback, John Walsh, who Walsh was someone who Mel Kiper, after that Weezer-Lock Copper Bowl in 94, we talked about in the wins video. Walsh was someone who Mel Kiper had as like the #1 quarterback prospect on his board, and he left early for BYU and opened the door for Steve Sarkisian to come to the program as a JC transfer. But John Walsh in '93, BYU was like a 6-5 team going into the Holiday Bowl, but still won the WAC like they always did back then. And Ohio State, they just never could get Ohio State. There's these certain programs that BYU could just not get. And Ohio State was one of them, Florida State, like I said earlier. But the Buckeyes, they've never played, oddly enough, in a regular season game, either in Columbus or Pro, but they had these kind of quirky games in postseason where there was a stretch where they were always locking horns. Another game I want to mention, it's listed as a tie in 1991, but it felt like a loss against Iowa, 13-13, last game of Ty Detmer's career.
Yep.
That was a game where BYU was the better team. Iowa really had no business being on the same field as BYU, but BYU choked that one, and it ended up as a tie. And BYU that year it was a weird record, 8-3-2 in 1991. First 3 games of the year, 0-3. Win their next, it was won 7 of their 8. Had a tie against San Diego State, and then they tied in San Diego again against Iowa. That one was just kind of bitter because ending Ty Detmer's career like that against an inferior Iowa team and a tie just didn't represent what Detmer did against like that Penn State game in '89. That was a game that kind of propelled, kind of set the momentum for Detmer to make a run at the Heisman in 1990 because he had over like 530 passing yards against Penn State, against a Joe Paterno Penn State defense. Defense maybe probably not the most. Its defense is right back then, or looking back now in retrospect with Penn State defense, not highly regarded because of the defensive coordinator they had, but still, Penn State defense, that was pretty amazing. BYU put up that many yards on a Joe Pa squad like that.
And for young college football fans, yes, there were ties in games. So there were actually 3 columns to the record. There was the wins, the losses, and the ties. And because of the way college football was played in a lot of areas of the country, strictly a ton of defense and running game, you had low-scoring games. Therefore, you produced a lot of ties. And there was actually a Michigan team in 1992 that went 9-0-3, tied 3 games. So, yeah, prior to 1997, I believe was the last year of the tie football game. Yeah, a lot of strange records out there in college football. Gladly, we've gotten past that, although it's funny to look back and see these crazy records that these teams would compile back then. Yeah.
And it's crazy, too, with the bowl games. You know, we're talking about all these stats and amazing records in these bowls. I mean, those 500-plus passing yards Detmer put up against Penn State don't even count. They don't even count in the record book still. It's a shame that a guy like Ty Detmer, who had all those amazing yards in bowl games, doesn't even count. Guys like Timmy Chang, Case Keenum, they came through the line. Graham Harrell, they all came through the line and set all these passing records. Their bowl games counted. Maybe BYU or NCAA should add in the guys in the past, add their stats, and let's see where the rankings are at then, because it's a shame that guys like Detmer, who had 15,000 yards without bowl games, his yards in those bowls don't even count. It'd be interesting to see where they're at now.
Yeah, I got to guess that he passed for 300 to, well, you said 530, and I do remember that total now against Penn State, but he had to have averaged 350 a game at least in those 3 or 4 bowl games, so you tack on another 1,200 yards at least for him.
Yeah.
And, NCAA, the records are there. All you have to do is backtrack and add them, and we have something called a computer now that can actually do it fairly quickly. It's data entry. There you go. I don't even know if it's data entry at this point, and it can be quickly done. I don't understand it.
Yeah, I'll never understand that either. But yeah, definitely a lot of heartbreaking losses though over the years for BYU, especially in bowls, where BYU until recently in the Mendenhall era really was very unsuccessful in a lot of bowl games. Great years, but their seasons always kind of ended on a sour note. We just lack poor performances in bowl games. But, you know, something, too, I find interesting with bowl games, looking at the past with BYU, you know, people always say, oh, you didn't go to a BCS bowl, you go to these games. But BYU was a yearly bowl participant in an era where it was a huge reward to go to a bowl game in the 80s. So we're talking about all these opponents and these gut-wrenching losses, but these were some great teams that played in really good football leagues. This wasn't like 6-6 Little Caesars Bowl stuff. This was some good football. I mean, you were one of the few teams in the country that actually went to a bowl game, so it was a big deal. And but still, getting there and coming up short always was bitter to swallow.
No doubt about it. Mitch Harper of LawlessRepublic.com. Please check out his insight and information there. Anything in particular right now, Mitch, you're working on?
Well, right now, with the off season, it's crazy to think we're 100 days away till BYU football, and we do a weekly podcast covering all the latest called Cougar Center. You can download that on iTunes. But we cover the latest news and notes on BYU sports over at lawlessrepublic.com, part of the fan-sided network, and it's really great. We have a loyal following. BYU fans in general are a great fan base, really passionate. It's a national following, and we've really enjoyed all the stuff that's came from it.
Hey, Mitch, thanks so much. I was lucky to have found you, and now I got a gold mine when it comes to BYU football, and it sounds like college football, period.
Yeah, I love college football. So to talk with you tonight, it was an absolute pleasure, and looking forward to all your videos with other bloggers around the country.
Thanks a lot, Mitch. We'll catch you next time.
No problem. See ya.